For 2 years, Sarah had given every ounce of her quiet, professional vigilance to keeping her father-in-law, Arthur, alive, only to be treated like a dangerous intruder in her own home. To Mark and his sister Brenda, her decade of clinical nursing experience was not a shield of protection, but a hostile weapon of control. They spoke over her at the dinner table, ignored her medical warnings, and dismissed her life-saving calculations as fancy hospital talk designed to make them look small. Mark's defensive skepticism had slowly turned their marriage into a cold war, leaving Sarah to carry the crushing weight of Arthur's failing heart entirely on her own exhausted shoulders. She had spent the last 19 hours on her feet, navigating the high-stakes decisions of the cardiac ward, only to return to a kitchen that felt as cold and unyielding as the family who refused to trust her. Exhaustion pressed heavily against her chest as she sat in the dim, quiet kitchen, waiting for the morning routine to begin. The yellow bulb under the range hood buzzed with a low, thin hum that seemed to vibrate directly behind Sarah's temples. It was 5:45 in the morning. Outside, the gray light of dawn was just beginning to seep through the bare branches of the oak tree in the front yard, casting long, skeleton-like shadows across the linoleum floor. Sarah sat at the laminate kitchen table, her nursing scrubs still smelling faintly of the hospital's industrial lavender soap and the sharp antiseptic sting of isopropyl alcohol. She had been awake for 19 hours. Her eyes burned, a dry, gritty sensation that made every blink feel like sandpaper. In front of her lay the inventory of Arthur's survival. There were 9 brown plastic prescription bottles, 3 white cardboard boxes of specialized supplements, and a blue-handled pair of surgical scissors. Sarah picked up a blister pack of carvedilol. She used the tip of the scissors to puncture the stubborn foil backing, a clean metallic pop that broke the quiet of the kitchen. 1 pink tablet tumbled into the small plastic cup. Next came the furosemide, then the potassium chloride, a pill so large it always looked like a choking hazard. This was her invisible ritual. For 2 years, since Arthur's first congestive heart failure exacerbation, she had managed this grid. She knew the exact timing, the crucial balance between the diuretic that drained the fluid from his swollen ankles and the potassium that kept his heart from skipping a beat. She had saved his life twice, once when his heart rate plummeted to 35 beats per minute because his previous doctor had miscalculated his beta blockers, and once when she noticed the subtle, wet rattle in his breathing before his lungs could completely drown in his own blood. The hallway floorboards groaned. Mark walked into the kitchen, his heavy work boots dragging. He was already wearing his grease-stained canvas jacket, the smell of cold diesel fuel and stale tobacco trailing behind him. He didn't look at Sarah. He walked straight to the coffee maker, lifted the pot, and poured the last dark sludge into a stained travel mug. He left the glass pot sitting on the hot plate where the remaining drops began to burn, filling the air with a bitter, acrid odor. "He still has not taken those water pills, has he?" Mark said, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. He leaned against the counter, tapping his dirty fingernails against the side of his mug. He looks like a ghost, Sarah. He was up 3 times last night going to the bathroom. He says he feels like he is drying up from the inside out. Sarah did not look up from the blister packs. She peeled back the foil on the spironolactone. He is not drying up, Mark. The water pills are what keep the fluid out of his lungs. If he does not take them, he suffocates. We have gone over this. Mark let out a short, dismissive grunt. He checked his phone, his thumb flicking rapidly across the cracked screen. Yeah, well, Brenda says we are giving him too much. She looked it up online. She says all these chemicals are what is making his kidneys fail. He was fine before he started taking that red one. Sarah paused, her fingers hovering over a small yellow pill. The red one was his iron supplement, prescribed for the chronic anemia that made him too weak to climb the 3 steps into the house. Brenda, Mark's sister, had a high school diploma and a collection of crystals on her windowsill, yet her internet searches carried more weight in this house than Sarah's 4 years of nursing school and a decade of clinical experience. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest. She calculated the energy required to explain, for the 20th time, the complex relationship between cardiorenal syndrome and chronic kidney disease. She thought about explaining how heart failure naturally degrades kidney function over time, and how the medications were actually slowing the decline, not causing it. It would take 20 minutes. It would involve Mark raising his voice, accusing her of talking down to him, and eventually walking out to his truck, slamming the door. She chose silence. She dropped the yellow pill into the cup. He needs the iron, Mark. Whatever, Mark said, tucking his phone into his pocket. He took a long sip of his coffee, wincing slightly at the heat. I am just saying, he is my dad. He knows his own body. If he says the pills are making him dizzy, maybe we should skip a few days. Let him flush his system out. You cannot just skip heart medication, Sarah said, her voice quiet but flat. That is not how his body works anymore. Mark didn't answer. He turned his back to her, reaching for his keys on the counter. The metal clinked loudly in the quiet kitchen. He walked toward the back door, his hand on the brass knob, before he stopped. Brenda is coming over at noon to check on him. Don't go filling his head with all that hospital talk before you leave for your shift. It just gets him agitated. The door clicked shut behind him, the latch catching with a dull, heavy thud. Outside, his diesel engine roared to life, a low, vibrating rumble that shook the window pane next to the table. Sarah sat alone again under the buzzing yellow light. She picked up the plastic pill organizer. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. She placed the daily doses into their tiny plastic compartments, her movements precise and mechanical. From the bedroom down the hall, a sound broke the quiet. It was a wet, heavy cough. It started low in the chest, followed by a shallow, desperate inhalation. Then another cough that sounded like someone trying to clear thick mud from a pipe. Sarah sat completely still, her hand hovering over the Thursday slot. She recognized that sound. It was the sound of fluid creeping back into the lower lobes of Arthur's lungs. It was the sound of a storm gathering. She looked at the pills in the cup. She looked at the empty hallway. The house was cold, the thermostat locked at 64 degrees because Arthur insisted the furnace used too much oil. She closed her eyes, took a slow, deep breath, and picked up the next blister pack. The hallway runner carpet was worn down to the grayed jute backing in a thin, straight line that led from the kitchen to Arthur's bedroom. Walking down it, Sarah could hear the high-pitched, microscopic whine of the old television tube before she even reached the doorway. It was a sound only she seemed to notice, a constant needle of noise that had vibrated in this house for decades. She pushed the door open. The air inside the small bedroom was heavy, trapped behind double-paned windows that had not been opened since the previous autumn. It smelled of eucalyptus ointment, dust, and the sour, familiar scent of an aging body that spent 20 hours a day in the same flannel pajamas. Arthur sat on the edge of his mattress, his shoulders hunched forward. His thin white hair was pressed flat on one side from sleep. He didn't look up when she entered. His eyes, clouded by cataracts and watery from the morning glare, were fixed on the flickering screen of a 19-inch color television resting on a scarred wooden dresser. A morning talk show host was laughing silently on screen, the volume muted down to a low murmur. "Time for your vitals, Arthur," Sarah said. Her voice was level, carrying the practiced neutrality she used on the hospital floor. Arthur let out a dry, rattling breath, but did not move his arm. He kept his gaze locked on the television. "I do not need my pressure checked today," he said, his voice raspy and thin. "I feel fine, just tired. My legs are heavy." "They are heavy because they are holding water," Sarah said. She sat on the edge of the vinyl-backed chair next to the bed, the material cold and stiff even through her thick scrubs. She unzipped her small nursing bag and pulled out the manual blood pressure cuff. The sound of the Velcro ripping open was loud and harsh in the small room. She reached for his left arm, her fingers gently finding his brachial pulse. His skin felt like old parchment, cool and dry to the touch, but beneath it, his radial artery was thumping with a hard, tense rhythm. Arthur didn't pull away, but he went rigid, his muscles tightening as she wrapped the blue nylon cuff around his arm. He stared at the wall just above the television, his jaw clamped shut. The silver dial on the gauge flickered as she pumped the black rubber bulb. 90, 120, 150. She placed the chest piece of her stethoscope over his inner elbow and slowly turned the metal valve, releasing the air in tiny, controlled whispers. 148 over 90. It was climbing. 2 days ago, it had been 128 over 74. The fluid was building, raising the pressure in his vascular system, forcing his heart to work twice as hard to pump the blood through his stiffening arteries. She slid the stethoscope up to his chest, placing the cold metal disc against his thin cotton shirt. "Breathe in," she said. Arthur took a shallow, ragged breath. Through the earpieces, Sarah heard it. It was not the clean, hollow rush of wind. It was a faint, wet crackle, like cellophane being gently crumpled at the very bottom of his lungs. It was louder than it had been yesterday. The fluid was rising, filling the tiny air sacs that should have been pulling in oxygen. She pulled the stethoscope away and folded it into her lap. "Did you take the blue pill this morning, Arthur? The furosemide?" Arthur finally turned his head to look at her. His eyes were small, watery, and defensive. "No," he said. "I left it on the tray." Sarah looked at the small plastic cup she had placed on his bedside table earlier. The tiny, round blue tablet lay at the bottom, lonely and dry. "Why not?" "Because it makes me run to the toilet every 20 minutes, Arthur said, his voice rising, gaining a sudden, sharp edge of stubbornness. "I cannot even get through a single television program without having to stand up, and my knees are too sore for that. Besides, Brenda said that pill is what is ruining my kidneys. She said you are drying me out on purpose, so I will have to go into a home." Sarah felt a dull throb behind her left eye. She sat very still, her hands resting on her knees. She calculated the mental energy required to explain the delicate balance of his heart and kidneys. She could tell him that without the diuretic, the pressure in his heart would backward flow into his lungs, and he would end up in the emergency room, gasping for air while a doctor shoved a plastic tube down his throat. She could tell him that Brenda's internet research was a dangerous fantasy. But she had explained this last week. She had explained it the month before that. Every explanation was met with the same suspicious squint, the same silent accusation that she was an outsider trying to control his life. To them, her medical knowledge was not a shield protecting Arthur from death. It was a weapon she used to make them feel small. "I am not trying to put you in a home, Arthur," she said quietly. "The water pill is what keeps you out of the hospital." "I am 82 years old," Arthur snapped, turning his face back toward the television screen. "I know my own body. I have had a bad back and bad knees since I was 40, and I am still here. I do not need a 20-year-old girl with a college degree telling me when I can and cannot go to the bathroom." Sarah was 32, not 20, and she had spent a decade managing critical care patients who were far sicker than Arthur. But in this room, she was just the girl who married his son. She was the one who didn't belong to the family bloodline. She stood up slowly, her knees cracking in the quiet room. She took the blood pressure cuff and tucked it back into her black bag, the zipper sliding closed with a smooth metallic click. She left the small blue pill in the plastic cup on the bedside table. "If you change your mind, it is right there," she said. Arthur didn't answer. He reached for the television remote, his thumb pressing the volume button. The low, muffled voice of the morning talk show host grew louder, filling the spaces between them with artificial cheer. Sarah walked out of the room, her boots silent on the worn carpet runner. As she reached the kitchen, she saw the dirty coffee mug Mark had left on the counter. The brown ring of dried coffee at the bottom was already hardening, forming a stubborn crust that would require scrubbing to remove. She stood by the sink, looking at the dirty cup. She didn't wash it. She walked past it, retrieved her car keys from the hook by the door, and went out into the cold morning air. Her shift at the hospital did not start for another 10 hours, but the silence of her own small apartment 3 miles away was the only place where she didn't have to calculate the cost of her own breathing. As she backed her sedan out of the gravel driveway, she saw the silhouette of Arthur's head through the bedroom window, perfectly still, staring at the blue light of the screen. The afternoon sun was a blade of white light cutting through the gap in the cheap vinyl blinds of the bedroom. It struck the opposite wall, illuminating the tiny, floating dust motes in the quiet apartment. Sarah lay on her side, her arm draped over her eyes to block the glare. Her body was heavy, sinking into the mattress with the dead weight exhaustion that only night shift nurses truly understood. Her feet still throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, a physical echo of the 12 miles she had walked on the hard hospital tiles the night before. She had almost fallen asleep, her mind finally drifting into that gray, soft borderland where the hum of the window air conditioner became a distant waterfall. Then her phone on the nightstand vibrated. It was not a ringtone. She kept it on vibrate, but the wooden surface of the table amplified the sound into a drilling, aggressive rattle that seemed to shake the headboard. Sarah did not move for 3 full vibrations. She calculated the cost of answering. If it was the hospital calling to ask her to cover an extra shift, she would say no. Her body could not take it. If it was a wrong number, she would lose the fragile momentum of her sleep. The phone stopped. Then, 3 seconds later, it began to rattle again. It was a second call from the same number. She pulled her arm away from her face, squinting against the harsh light, and reached for the device. The screen showed Mark's name. She swiped the screen and put the phone to her ear. "Mark?" "Sarah, you need to get back over to Dad's house right now," Mark said. His voice was not loud, but it had a tight, defensive strain that immediately put her on guard. He was speaking quickly, his words crowding together. "What is wrong?" Sarah sat up slowly, her feet swinging over the side of the bed. The cold air from the unit hit her bare shoulders, making her shiver. "Is he having trouble breathing?" "No, he is not having trouble breathing," Mark said, and in the background, Sarah could hear the distinct, high-pitched kitchen timer buzzing at Arthur's house, followed by the muffled sound of Brenda's voice raising in anger. "He is throwing up, Sarah. He is sick to his stomach, and he is dizzy. Brenda is here, and she is looking at his bathroom. She says his stool is completely black. She says he is bleeding inside." Sarah let out a slow, quiet breath through her nose. She closed her eyes, her forehead resting against her free hand. "Mark, did he take the iron supplement this morning?" "Yeah, he took it," Mark said. "Brenda gave it to him with his tea." "Did he eat anything first? Did he eat the oatmeal I left in the container?" "No," Mark said, his tone turning sharp, as if her questions were an attempt to deflect blame. "He said he wasn't hungry. Brenda gave him his tea and the pills, like you wrote down on that little card. Now his stomach is burning, he is throwing up green spit, and his stool is black. Brenda says black stool means internal bleeding. She says you are giving him something that is eating his stomach out." Sarah took a deep breath, forcing her voice to remain steady, though her chest felt tight. "Mark, listen to me. Iron supplements cause black stool. It is a completely normal, harmless side effect of the medicine. The iron that his body does not absorb turns the stool dark. It is not blood. And iron is very hard on an empty stomach. If he takes it without food, it causes severe nausea and vomiting. That is why I wrote on the card, in capital letters, to give it to him with his oatmeal." There was a pause on the line. Sarah could hear Mark relaying this to Brenda. Her voice came back through the receiver, loud and sharp, though she was talking to Mark, not Sarah. "She is just making excuses." Brenda's voice was clear enough to make out. "Ask her why his blood pressure is so high then. It was 150 when I checked it with the machine I bought at the pharmacy. She is trying to dry him up with those water pills, and now his stomach is bleeding. She is poisoning him, Mark." Mark came back on the line. "Sarah, Brenda says the pharmacy machine says his pressure is way up. If the pills are supposed to keep it down, why is it so high? We are stopping all of them until we can get him to a real doctor tomorrow." "Do not stop his medications, Mark," Sarah said, her voice rising slightly for the first time, though she immediately forced it back down. If you stop the furosemide, the water will build up in his lungs again. His pressure is high because he is anxious, he is vomiting, and he didn't take his morning dose. If you skip his pills, he will be in the emergency room by tomorrow morning. We are not taking advice from someone who is making him throw up black fluid, Mark said. His voice had hardened into that familiar, stubborn wall. He was no longer asking, he was telling her. Brenda is right. Something is wrong with what you are giving him. You need to come over here and show us the bottles. Brenda wants to see the pharmacy labels. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her feet on the brown carpet. She had 4 hours before she had to be back at the hospital for another 12-hour shift. If she went over there now, she would spend those 4 hours standing in Arthur's kitchen, being cross-examined by a woman who believed that apple cider vinegar could cure diabetes, and a husband who refused to learn the difference between a beta blocker and a diuretic. She would be treated like a suspect in a crime she had spent 2 years preventing. She felt the physical weight of her exhaustion, a heavy, leaden blanket over her brain. She calculated the energy. "I will be there in 15 minutes, she said. She did not wait for Mark to reply. She ended the call, set the phone on the nightstand, and stood up. Her joints popped in the quiet room. She walked to the closet, pulled out a clean pair of dark blue scrubs, and began to dress in the dim yellow light of her bedroom, her movements slow, heavy, and completely silent. The gravel of Arthur's driveway crunched under Sarah's sedan. The car's radiator fan whined loudly as she turned off the ignition, a long, dying hiss that matched her own fatigue. She sat in the driver's seat for a full minute, her hands resting on the steering wheel. She watched the front window of the house. The white lace curtains, yellowed by years of Arthur's tobacco smoke, didn't twitch, but she knew they were being watched. She grabbed her black medical bag from the passenger seat. Inside the house, the heat was stifling. Brenda had probably turned up the thermostat because she thought Arthur was cold. It smelled of boiled cabbage, old tea leaves, and the sharp chemical odor of store-bought disinfectant. Brenda was standing by the kitchen counter, her arms crossed over her chest. She was wearing a faded fleece vest, her reading glasses pushed up into her hair. Mark sat at the laminate table, his heavy work boots still on, tracing a circle in a wet spot on the tabletop with his index finger. On the table lay the brown pill bottles Sarah had neatly organized earlier, now scattered haphazardly like knocked-over bowling pins. Next to them was a cheap plastic wrist blood pressure monitor from a grocery store pharmacy, its gray fabric cuff unraveled. "You are late," Brenda said, her voice thin and sharp. She didn't look at Sarah's face. She looked at Sarah's nursing bag. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She walked to the sink. She turned on the tap, waited for the water to run warm, and squirted a pump of liquid dish soap onto her hands. She washed them thoroughly, the smell of cheap lemon soap rising in the steam, her mind counting to 20. This was her clinical routine, her way of establishing a boundary. "The traffic on the bridge was backed up," Sarah said flatly, drying her hands on a clean paper towel she brought from her bag, since Arthur's kitchen towel was damp and gray. Brenda gestured to the scattered bottles. "We looked at these. Mark said you told him this red one is just iron, But it says right here on the warning label, may cause severe gastrointestinal distress. Why would you give him something that says it is going to ruin his stomach, especially when he is already weak? Sarah leaned against the counter, keeping her distance. Brenda had bypassed the actual active ingredient and went straight to the generic warning label that printed on every single prescription bottle. Sarah could explain that almost every oral medication has a gastrointestinal warning, or that the cardiologist specifically ordered the iron because Arthur's hemoglobin was down to 9. Instead, she chose to present the hard clinical facts without emotion. His cardiologist, Dr. Vance, prescribed it, Sarah said. His blood count is low. If his blood count is low, his heart has to pump faster to get oxygen to his organs. That makes his heart failure worse. The iron is necessary. Well, it is making him throw up, Brenda said, stepping closer, her voice rising in triumph. And look at his pressure. I took it 3 times with this wrist cuff. It was 156, 158. 160. The machine does not lie, Sarah. You have got him on all these water pills, but his pressure is through the roof. It means the pills are not working, or worse. Sarah looked at the wrist monitor. Wrist monitors are notorious for being inaccurate in elderly patients with peripheral vascular disease, she said, her voice steady, almost robotic. They read high if the arm is not held exactly at heart level. I took his pressure with a manual cuff 45 minutes before I left. It was 148/90. High, but expected given his stress. We do not trust your manual cuff, Brenda said, her face tightening. You probably just say whatever numbers make you look good. We are going to trust the digital one. It is brand new. Mark finally looked up from the table. He looked tired, caught between his sister's loud certainty and his wife's quiet, cold competence. Sarah, he is really sick in there. He is shaking. He says his chest feels heavy. The wet, rattling cough echoed from the back bedroom again, a dull, hollow sound that seemed to vibrate through the kitchen floorboards. Sarah felt a pull of professional alarm, but she kept her face mask-like. She knew the chest heaviness was not from the iron. It was the fluid. Arthur was beginning to drown in his own secretions, and his family was about to withhold the only medication that could save him because of a dark stool and a cheap digital wrist cuff. She looked at the scattered pill bottles on the table. She calculated the energy of arguing, of trying to force them to understand that their ignorance was actively killing him. She looked at Mark's defensive posture, at Brenda's smug, hostile gaze. "Let us go look at him," Sarah said, turning toward the hallway. The air in Arthur's bedroom had changed. The dusty wool smell was gone, replaced by the sharp medicinal sting of peppermint oil. Brenda had rubbed it onto his collarbone and throat, claiming it would open his airways naturally. To Sarah, the scent was suffocating, a sweet, heavy mask over the unmistakable smell of failing lungs. Arthur was propped up against the headboard, 3 flat pillows wedged behind his back. His breathing was fast and shallow, his shoulders rising and falling with a tense, jerky motion. His lips had a faint, dusky gray tint around the edges, a subtle sign of oxygen starvation that his family was completely blind to. Mark stood in the doorway, his large frame blocking the light from the hall. He kept his hands crammed deep into his jacket pockets, his eyes shifting nervously between his father and his sister. Sarah walked to the side of the bed. "Arthur," she said, her voice soft but firm, "let me see your legs." Arthur didn't protest. He looked too tired to fight. Sarah gently rolled up the leg of his flannel pajama pants, exposing his shin. His skin was tight, stretched so thin it looked glossy and polished, like plastic. The hair on his lower legs had fallen out months ago, a common symptom of poor circulation. She placed her thumb firmly against his shin bone, right above the ankle. She pressed down, applying steady, heavy pressure while silently counting to 5 in her head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When she lifted her thumb, a deep, pale crater remained in Arthur's flesh. It was a hollow pit, nearly half an inch deep, that did not bounce back. The skin stayed white and depressed, a silent ledger of the gallons of excess fluid trapped in his tissues. "This is 3+ pitting edema," Sarah said, her voice dropping into her quiet, clinical tone. She pointed to the indentation, which was only slowly, agonizingly beginning to shallow out. His body cannot handle the fluid. Because his heart is weak, it cannot pump the blood hard enough to keep it moving. The water settles in his legs first. When he lies down, that water shifts up into his chest. That is why his lungs are crackling. That is why he is coughing. Brenda stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the pit in her father's leg. "He has always had bad circulation," she said, her voice defensive, her hands on her hips. "It is because he sits in that chair all day. If he got up and walked around the yard, his legs would go back to normal. You are making it sound like his heart is stopping just because he has a little swelling." "It is not a little swelling, Brenda," Sarah said, keeping her gaze steady. "It is fluid overload. If we do not give him the diuretic to flush this water out, his lungs will fill completely. He will not be able to breathe." "Well, what about his kidneys?" Brenda demanded, crossing her arms tight. "I read that those water pills make the kidneys fail. If his kidneys fail, he dies anyway. You are just swapping one problem for another because the doctors want to keep him on a leash." Sarah felt the familiar, cold exhaustion creeping deeper into her bones. She looked at Mark, hoping for some sign of understanding, but he was looking down at his boots, his jaw clenched. He wanted Brenda to be right. He wanted his father's illness to be a simple thing, something that could be fixed with a short walk and some tea, rather than a slow, terminal decline that required constant medical intervention. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her personal pulse oximeter, a small black plastic clip. She gently took Arthur's left hand. His fingers were cold, his nails slightly blue. She slid the device onto his index finger. The small red light inside the clip began to pulse against his skin. On the tiny screen, the numbers bounced. 91, 89, 88. It settled on 88%. Sarah turned the screen toward Mark. 88, she said. Normal oxygen saturation is 95 to 100. Anything under 90 means his brain, his kidneys, and his heart are not getting enough oxygen. He is working too hard just to stay conscious. Brenda scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "Those cheap little plastic things are not accurate," she said. "I bought one for my son when he had the flu, and it said 92, but he was running around the living room just fine. Besides, his hands are freezing. Of course it is going to read low if his hands are cold." "Arthur, tell her. Your hands are cold, right?" "Yeah," Arthur muttered, his eyes closed. "Cold." "See?" Brenda said, looking at Mark with a triumphant smile. "It is just because his hands are cold. You are trying to scare us, Sarah. You always do this. You make everything into a life-or-death crisis just so you can be the boss of this family." Sarah looked at her husband. Mark's eyes finally met hers, but there was no support in them. There was only a heavy, stubborn resentment. He was tired of the tension, tired of being caught between his wife's clinical coldness and his family's loud, defensive pride. "Maybe we should just let him rest today, Sarah," Mark said quietly, his voice flat. "Brenda is right. His hands are cold. We will call the clinic tomorrow morning and see what the doctor says." Sarah sat completely still. She looked at the oximeter, still blinking 88% on Arthur's blue-tinged finger. She looked at the deep white pit still visible on his shin. She realized, with a quiet, devastating clarity, that her presence here was no longer a shield. It was a target. Every piece of medical evidence she produced would be twisted into an accusation of control. She slowly squeezed the clip, removed the oximeter from Arthur's finger, and slid it back into her pocket. "Okay," she said. The air on the 4th floor of St. Jude Community Hospital was scrubbed clean by heavy-duty HEPA filters, leaving only the sharp chemical tang of isopropyl alcohol and the faint, sweet scent of industrial floor wax. It was 6:45 in the evening. Sarah stood at the central nurses' station of the cardiac telemetry unit. She pulled a purple-capped container of disinfectant wipes from the shelf and began her evening routine. She pulled out a thick, wet sheet, the eye-watering scent of bleach hitting her nose, as she thoroughly wiped down the computer keyboard, the desk surface, and the plastic receiver of the telephone. Every click of her fingers on the rubbery keys was crisp. Around her, the quiet symphony of the ward played out, the rhythmic, high-pitched chirps of 8 different heart monitors undulating across the wall-mounted screens, the soft hum of the pneumatic tube system, and the distant, polite chime of a patient's call light. In this space, Sarah was not an intrusive outsider. She was the charge nurse. Dr. Evans, one of the hospital's senior cardiologists, walked up to the desk, his white lab coat open, a manila folder tucked under his arm. He looked tired, but when he saw Sarah, his expression softened into one of genuine respect. "Sarah," he said, leaning against the high counter, "did we get the lab results back on 42? I saw you ordered a repeat potassium level." "We did," Sarah said, her fingers moving efficiently across the screen to pull up the chart. "It came back at 3.1. I held his evening dose of furosemide and called the resident to get a potassium replacement protocol started. He is already infusing." Dr. Evans sighed, nodding slowly. "Good catch, Sarah. If we had run that diuretic with his potassium that low, he would have thrown himself into an arrhythmia by midnight. I appreciate your eyes on him. You saved us a serious complication tonight." "Thank you, Doctor," Sarah said, her voice even. Her chest felt light, but the feeling was quickly followed by a dull, cold ache. Here, her vigilance was called a good catch. Here, her deep understanding of fluid shifts and electrolyte balances was respected, even relied upon, to keep people alive. At Arthur's house, that same vigilance was viewed as a control tactic, a hostile attempt to dominate a family that wanted to be left alone with their comforting illusions. Her phone vibrated in her scrub pocket. Hospital policy strictly forbade personal phone use at the nurses' station, so Sarah waited until she walked into the clean supply utility room to pull it out. The room was quiet, filled with the sterile smell of packaged plastic tubing and saline bags stacked neatly on metal wire shelves. The text was from Mark. He had sent a photograph. Sarah tapped the screen to enlarge it. The image showed a bowl of dark, greasy broth filled with thick chunks of potato and meat sitting on the cluttered nightstand next to Arthur's bed. The accompanying text read, "Dad wanted something hot. Brenda made him some canned beef and potato soup. He ate the whole bowl. He is sleeping now." Sarah stared at the picture. She knew that specific brand of canned soup. It was a staple in blue-collar kitchens, cheap and filling, but it was practically poison for a patient in congestive heart failure. A single serving contained nearly 980 milligrams of sodium. The average can held 2 servings. If Arthur had eaten the whole bowl, he had just consumed almost 2,000 milligrams of sodium in a single sitting, his entire recommended daily allowance, in a highly concentrated, easily absorbed liquid form. Sodium acts like a massive sponge in the bloodstream. Within hours, it would pull pints of water from his tissues back into his vascular system, rapidly expanding his blood volume. His weakened heart would not be able to pump the sudden influx of fluid. It would back up, leaking into his lungs, drowning him from the inside out. Sarah's fingers hovered over the keyboard of her phone. Her natural instinct, honed by years of emergency clinical training, was to type a long, urgent warning. She wanted to text, "He cannot have canned soup, Mark. The sodium is too high. You need to watch his breathing closely tonight. If he starts coughing or cannot lie flat, you need to take him to the emergency room immediately." But she stopped. She looked at the plastic packaging of a sterile central line kit on the shelf in front of her. She remembered Brenda's voice screeching through the phone earlier. "She is just making excuses. She is trying to dry him up. She is poisoning him, Mark." She remembered Mark's flat, stubborn tone. "Brenda is right. Something is wrong with what you are giving him." If she sent the warning, they would not thank her. Brenda would tell Mark that Sarah was trying to starve their father, that she was criticizing their cooking, that she was trying to prove how much smarter she was than them. They would ignore the advice, and they would resent her for giving it. She calculated the energy, the metabolic cost of caring for people who viewed her care as malice, was too high. It was draining her, leaving her hollowed out for the patients who actually wanted to live. She slowly pressed the backspace key, deleting her half-written text. She typed a single word, "Okay." She hit send, locked the phone, and slipped it back into her pocket. She took a slow, deep breath of the sterile, filtered air of the supply room, adjusted the stethoscope around her neck, and walked back out onto the floor, leaving the weight of Arthur's impending storm behind her. 3:15 in the morning was the hour of deep silence in the hospital. The main overhead fluorescent tubes had been switched off, leaving only the low, warm, amber nightlights along the baseboards of the corridors. The floor was so quiet that the soft, rubbery squeak of Sarah's shoes echoed faintly against the drywall as she walked. She pushed open the door to room 408. The patient, Mr. Geller, was an 84-year-old retired machinist who had been admitted 2 days prior with acute on chronic heart failure, the exact same diagnosis as Arthur. But unlike Arthur, Mr. Geller's room was a place of quiet, orderly recovery. Sarah began her physical routine. She walked to the side of his bed, her movements fluid and practiced in the semi-darkness. She reached down and lifted the plastic urinal hanging from the bed rail. She carried it to the small bathroom, poured the pale yellow fluid into a plastic graduated cylinder, and held it up to the light of the vanity. 450 milliliters. She noted the number in her mind. She returned to the bedside, checking the IV pump. The green LED display glowed in the dark, indicating that his low-dose diuretic was infusing at exactly 40 milliliters per hour. She gently pressed her fingers against Mr. Geller's ankle. The skin was soft, returning to its normal elasticity. The deep pits that had been there yesterday were almost entirely gone, his kidneys successfully filtering out the excess fluid. Mr. Geller stirred, his eyes fluttering open in the dim light. He looked up at Sarah, a soft, grateful smile creasing his wrinkled face. "Thank you, dear," he whispered, his voice dry and raspy. "You always make it comfortable." "Go back to sleep, Mr. Geller," Sarah whispered back, her voice gentle as she reached down to adjust his light blanket, tucking it around his shoulders. "You are doing great. Your lungs sound clear tonight." He let out a long, peaceful sigh, his eyes closing as he drifted back to sleep, his breathing deep, slow, and completely effortless. Sarah stood by the bed for a moment, her hand resting on the metal rail. The contrast was a physical weight in her chest. Here was a man who trusted the medicine, who trusted her eyes and her hands, and his body was healing. 3 miles away, another man with the exact same disease was sleeping in a room filled with peppermint oil and suspicion, his lungs slowly filling with the sodium-heavy liquid of a canned soup dinner. She walked out of the room, letting the heavy door click shut behind her. She made her way to the small staff break room at the end of the hall. The room was cold, the air conditioning unit humming a monotonous, low-frequency rattle. On the laminate table sat a half-eaten cardboard box of glazed donuts from the morning shift, the sugar glaze turning white, dry, and crusty under the harsh fluorescent light. Sarah sat down in a blue vinyl chair that squeaked loudly under her weight. She pulled her phone from her scrub pocket. There were no new text messages, no missed calls. On any other night shift over the past 2 years, Sarah's phone would have been a lifeline of constant, exhausting communication. By 3 in the morning, she would have sent at least 4 text messages to Mark. She would have texted him at 10 o'clock. "Make sure you put the oxygen cannula on Dad before he goes to sleep." She would have texted at midnight. Did you empty his bedside urinal? Keep track of how much it is. She would have texted at 2 in the morning. If he is restless, prop him up on 3 pillows. Do not let him lie flat. She had spent her breaks pacing this very break room, talking Mark through the steps of checking Arthur's oxygen concentrator filter, or reminding him to restrict Arthur's fluids to 1.5 liters for the day. She had been Arthur's remote cardiac monitor, the invisible engine keeping him stable from a distance. Tonight, she had sent nothing. She had made a conscious, silent calculation. Every text she sent was another drop of her own energy poured into a void where it was viewed as interference. If they believed her care was poison, then she would stop administering it. She would let them manage the complex, volatile machine of Arthur's failing cardiovascular system with their own resources. She looked at the blank black screen of her phone. She knew what would happen. Without her constant, quiet prompts, the invisible structure she had built around Arthur's life would begin to decay. Mark was a man of routine, but only when someone else wrote the schedule. He did not think about sodium content or fluid restriction or medication compatibility. He just wanted things to be quiet. Brenda was loud and confident, but her knowledge was built on internet search algorithms and pride. She did not know how to listen to the subtle, wet click of a lung, or how to interpret the hard, pounding rhythm of a failing kidney. They thought her care was a naturally occurring resource, like water from a tap, always there, always free, requiring no effort on their part. They only noticed the water when the tap ran completely dry. Sarah slipped the phone back into her pocket. She didn't feel angry. She didn't feel vengeful. She felt a profound, heavy quietness, like the hospital corridors at dawn. She stood up from the vinyl chair, walked to the sink, and washed her face with cold water, watching her tired, pale reflection in the mirror above the basin. Her shift would end in less than 4 hours. She would go home, she would sleep in her dark room, and she would let the natural laws of medicine unfold without her intervention. The morning air of the concrete parking garage was thick with the heavy, damp smell of wet asphalt, old oil stains, and the cold exhaust of dozens of cars starting up at the end of the shift. It was 8:15 on Thursday morning. Sarah sat in the driver's seat of her sedan, her hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. She had not yet turned the key in the ignition. She watched a flock of pigeons fluttering near the open edge of the garage, their gray wings flashing against the pale, watery blue of the morning sky. Her head felt light, a hollow, airy sensation that always came after 12 hours of constant, high-alert decision-making. She reached out, turned the key, and the engine coughed to life with its familiar metallic rattle. She drove out of the garage, the tires squealing softly on the smooth concrete ramp. A mile down the road, she pulled into the drive-through lane of a small coffee shop. When the cashier handed her the paper cup, the heat radiated through the cardboard sleeve, warming her stiff, cold fingers. She breathed in the dark, roasted scent of the black coffee, using the heat of the cup to ground herself as she waited at the red light. The phone in her cup holder buzzed, its vibration rattling against the hard plastic. the screen illuminated with Mark's name. Sarah took a slow sip of the hot coffee, letting the liquid settle before she reached for the phone. She tapped the speaker icon and set the device back into the cup holder. "Mark?" "Sarah, we have a problem here," Mark said. His voice was louder than usual, competing with the background sound of his truck's heater blowing on high. "Brenda is over at Dad's, and she is trying to get him dressed so she can take him to his doctor's appointment this afternoon. But his feet are huge, Sarah. She cannot even get his wide slippers on him. They are like balloons." Sarah drove through the green light, keeping her eyes on the road. Her face remained completely expressionless. "What did the clinic say when you called them this morning?" Mark hesitated, his voice dropping slightly. "Well, Brenda was supposed to call them at 8, but she got busy helping him out of bed. She is going to call them in a little bit. But Dad is complaining that his calves feel tight, like they are going to burst. Brenda wants to know which pill is the one for the swelling. Is it the blue one or the little white one?" Sarah felt her hands tighten slightly on the steering wheel, but she relaxed them, letting her shoulders drop. She calculated the energy of this interaction. Yesterday, Mark and Brenda had accused her of using the medications to dry Arthur out and ruin his kidneys. They had made a firm, stubborn decision to stop all his medications. Now, because Arthur's tissues were rapidly filling with the water from his canned soup and his skipped doses, they were panicking. They wanted her to step back in, to give them a quick, simple solution, to authorize a dose so they could shift the responsibility of the outcome back onto her shoulders. If she told them to give the furosemide and Arthur went to the bathroom too much or felt dizzy later, Brenda would say Sarah had ordered them to poison him again. If she told them not to give it, Brenda would say Sarah was withholding care out of spite. "I cannot tell you which pill to give him, Mark," Sarah said, her voice calm, flat, and steady. "What do you mean you cannot tell me?" Mark's tone sharpened, a familiar edge of defensive anger creeping in. "You are his nurse. You have been giving him these pills for 2 years. Brenda just wants to make sure she does not give him the wrong one. Just tell me the color. Yesterday you told me that you and Brenda were stopping all of his medications until he saw a doctor," Sarah said, her voice remaining perfectly level as she turned onto her street. "You told me you did not trust the manual blood pressure readings or the medications I was organizing. Since you have taken over his medical care, you need to consult his doctor. I cannot prescribe or direct his medication doses." "Sarah, this is ridiculous," Mark barked. "He is my dad. He is in pain. We are just asking for a simple answer. You do not have to be so cold about it." "Everything is documented on the laminated chart on the kitchen counter," Sarah said, her car idling in her apartment's gravel driveway. "Every medication, its color, its purpose, and its dose is written there in plain print. If Brenda wants to administer his pills, she can read the chart, or she can wait until his appointment this afternoon and let his cardiologist decide." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Sarah could hear the wind whistling through the cracked window of Mark's truck. "You are really going to do this?" Mark asked, his voice low, thick with a mixture of disbelief and resentment. "You are really going to just walk away and let him suffer because your feelings got hurt yesterday?" "This is not about my feelings, Mark," Sarah said quietly. "This is about boundaries. You asked me to stop managing his care because you did not trust my clinical judgment. I have stopped. I am going to sleep now. My phone will be on silent." She didn't wait for him to argue. She reached down, tapped the red button on the screen, and ended the call. She sat in the quiet of her parked car for a moment, the only sound being the ticking of the cooling engine. She picked up the phone, swiped down on the screen, and toggled the Do Not Disturb icon. The small crescent moon appeared at the top of her screen, silencing all calls, all texts, and all notifications. She took her purse and her nursing bag from the passenger seat, got out of the car, and walked toward her apartment building. Her steps felt lighter than they had in months, as if a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders, leaving only the cool, quiet morning air around her. The transition from deep, dreamless sleep to waking was slow and heavy. Sarah lay on her back, staring up at the white plaster ceiling of her bedroom. The blade of white sunlight that had cut through the blinds earlier had softened into a dull amber glow, casting long, peaceful shadows across the bedroom floor. It was 3:15 in the afternoon. She sat up, her spine popping with a dry, stiff click. The apartment was entirely quiet, save for the rhythmic, metallic tick of the small wall clock in the kitchen. There was no smell of burnt coffee, no vibration of diesel engines in the driveway, and no wet, rattling cough echoing from down the hall. There was only the calm, neutral stillness of her own space. Sarah walked into the kitchen. Her feet were bare, the cold linoleum floor feeling crisp and solid beneath her soles. She began her physical routine. She lifted the glass kettle, held it under the kitchen tap, and watched the clear water swirl and fill to the 2-cup line. She set the kettle on the stove and turned the plastic knob. The gas igniter clicked 3 times, a sharp metallic sound, before a ring of neat blue flames bloomed beneath the glass, casting a pale, flickering light onto the Formica counter. As she waited for the water to heat, she walked back to the bedroom nightstand and picked up her phone. She swiped down on the screen and tapped the Do Not Disturb icon, turning off the silent mode. Immediately, the screen began to light up. The notifications descended in a silent, rapid cascade, stacking on top of one another like shingles. There were 7 missed calls and 5 text messages, all from Mark and Brenda. Sarah leaned against the kitchen counter, her expression remaining perfectly calm, and began to read the digital record of their day. The first text had arrived at 10:14 in the morning from Brenda. The text read, "His pressure is 162. We skipped the blue pill like we said, but he is coughing more. He says his chest is tight. Are you happy now?" The second text was from Mark, sent at 11:30. The text read, "We are at the clinic. They are making us wait in the lobby. Dad is really short of breath. He is sweating. Why aren't you answering your phone?" The third text, sent at 1:45 in the afternoon, was also from Mark. The tone had shifted, the initial defensive anger replaced by a tense, vibrating confusion. The text read, "Dr. Vance is furious. He asked why we stopped the water pills. Brenda tried to tell him about the warning on the bottle about kidney damage, and Dr. Vance raised his voice at her. He said Dad's kidneys are fine, and that withholding the water pills is what is making him suffocate. Sarah, why didn't you explain this to us better? If it was that important, you should have made sure we understood." Brenda is crying. Sarah stared at the words on the screen. "Why didn't you explain this to us better?" The sheer, breathtaking absurdity of the statement did not make her angry. It was a classic display of weaponized incompetence, a desperate attempt to shift the weight of their own stubborn failure onto her shoulders. She had spent 2 years explaining it. She had drawn color-coded charts. She had printed out educational pamphlets. She had sat at Arthur's table and walked them through the mechanics of heart failure until her throat was dry. They had not listened because they did not want to listen. They had preferred Brenda's simple, internet-fueled conspiracies because those conspiracies allowed them to do nothing, to skip the hard work of daily vigilance, and to feel superior to the fancy hospital talk they so deeply mistrusted. Now that the reality of Arthur's failing body had crashed through their illusions, they were looking for a scapegoat. They wanted to blame her for not forcing them to listen. The kettle on the stove began to whistle, a low, rising tone that quickly became a sharp, piercing hiss. Sarah set the phone on the counter. She turned off the gas burner, the blue flames vanishing instantly. She poured the boiling water over a chamomile tea bag in a thick ceramic mug, watching the water turn a deep golden amber. The steam rose into her face, smelling of warm earth and sweet flowers. She picked up her phone again. The last text, sent at 2:30, read, "They are doing blood work and a chest x-ray. They are talking about admitting him to the hospital. You need to come down here right now and talk to these doctors. We do not understand what they are saying. They are using all these words. Please, Sarah, just come." Sarah held the warm ceramic mug in her hand, feeling the heat penetrate her palm. She calculated the energy. If she went to the clinic, she would have to step between them and the medical staff. She would have to translate the doctor's frustration into terms Mark and Brenda could understand, while simultaneously absorbing their silent, resentful glares. She would be expected to fix the mess they had made, only for them to return to their old habits the moment Arthur was stable again. She would be giving away her peace, her rest, and her professional dignity for people who had called her a poisoner only 24 hours ago. She placed her thumb on the keyboard screen. She typed, "I am glad Dr. Vance was able to evaluate him. I am preparing for my night shift and will not be able to come to the clinic. Please let me know what the admission or discharge plan is once they decide." She did not offer an explanation. She did not apologize. She did not defend her past explanations. She pressed send. She set the phone face down on the counter, took her mug of tea, and walked over to the kitchen window. Outside, a gentle gray rain was beginning to fall, speckling the glass and darkening the green leaves of the oak tree. She took a slow, quiet sip of her tea, letting the warmth settle in her chest, entirely untouched by the storm brewing across town. The hospital locker room was small and brightly lit by a humming fluorescent tube that flickered slightly at the corner of the ceiling. It smelled of stale coffee, dry deodorant, and the crisp, clean scent of freshly laundered cotton scrubs. It was 6:15 on Thursday evening. Sarah stood in front of locker 42. She began her physical routine. She pulled her dark blue nursing scrubs over her head, the fabric stiff and smelling faintly of the hospital's industrial laundry detergent. She folded her street clothes, placing them neatly in the bottom of the narrow metal locker, then hung her canvas jacket on the small wire hook. She picked up her plastic identification badge, sliding her thumb over the smooth, laminated surface before clipping it to her V-neck collar. She closed the metal locker door, the latch catching with a sharp, hollow clang that echoed off the rows of green metal lockers. She walked out of the locker room and down the long, quiet hallway toward the fourth-floor telemetry unit. As she approached the double-glass doors, she pressed her palm against the automatic hand sanitizer dispenser on the wall. The machine let out a soft, dry whistle as it squirted a cold dollop of alcohol gel into her palm. She rubbed her hands together, the cold liquid evaporating quickly, leaving her skin tight and smelling of sterile medical soap. She walked behind the central nurses' station, pulled out a rolling black chair, and sat down at her terminal. She logged into the hospital's electronic health record database, her fingers moving across the keyboard with automatic, practiced speed. The screen glowed blue in the dim light of the ward. As the charge nurse, her first task was to review the active patient list for the floor and assign them to the night shift staff. She scrolled down the digital board. Bed 414A, Arthur Miller. Age 82. Admitting diagnosis, acute decompensated heart failure. Sarah paused, her hand resting on the plastic mouse. She did not blink. She clicked on the blue hyperlink of Arthur's name, opening his admitting chart. The emergency department notes from 4:45 p.m. were detailed and clinical. The admitting physician had written, "Patient presents with severe dyspnea at rest, bilateral 3+ pitting pedal edema extending to the mid-calf, and oxygen saturation of 86% on room air. Pulmonary auscultation reveals diffuse wet rails bilaterally. Chest X-ray demonstrates significant pulmonary congestion and pleural effusions." Sarah scrolled further down to the cardiology consult notes written by Dr. Vance. The note read, "Decompensation precipitated by patient's family withholding prescribed furosemide therapy due to self-identified kidney concerns. Family education attempted but met with significant resistance. Patient requires aggressive intravenous diuretic therapy." There it was, preserved forever in Arthur's official, permanent medical record. The stark, cold, and indisputable record of their ignorance, documented by a licensed cardiologist. It was no longer a domestic argument in a cold kitchen. It was a clinical fact. Sarah sat back in her chair. She calculated the energy of her shift. Under normal circumstances, if Arthur had been admitted to her floor, she would have immediately intervened. She would have assigned herself as his primary nurse. She would have called the emergency room to expedite his transfer, made sure he had the extra pillows he liked, and spent her breaks sitting by his bedside to keep him calm. She would have negotiated with the resident doctors to get him a low-sodium dinner tray and made sure the floor staff knew he was hard of hearing in his left ear. She would have carried the entire burden of his hospitalization on her back. Now she looked at the assignment board. There were 4 floor nurses on duty tonight. Jessica was one of them. Jessica was an experienced, highly competent RN who had worked in telemetry for 7 years. She was also notoriously strict. She did not tolerate family members hovering over her patients. She did not allow extra visitors after hours, and she shut down any attempt to argue with her clinical interventions with a cold, professional firmness. Sarah clicked Arthur's bed number and dragged it under Jessica's name on the digital roster. She would not be his nurse. She would not be his advocate. She would remain the charge nurse, managing the flow of the entire unit from behind her desk, keeping a strict, professional distance. She would let the hospital system treat him exactly like any other 82-year-old patient who had failed to comply with his medical regimen. She heard the heavy double-glass doors of the unit slide open. The sound of heavy, squeaking work boots on the clean linoleum floor broke the quiet of the ward. Sarah looked up from her screen. Mark was walking toward the nurses' station. He was still wearing his grease-stained work jacket, his hair messy, his eyes bloodshot and ringed with dark circles of exhaustion. He looked smaller than he had that morning, his shoulders hunched, his hands nervously twisting his truck keys. He stopped at the high counter, looking down at Sarah. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He looked at her clean, crisp scrubs, her neat badge, and the quiet, professional authority that surrounded her behind the desk. "Sarah," he said, his voice raspy and dry. "They put him in room 414. We have been waiting in there for an hour. Nobody has come in to give him his water pill yet. Brenda is trying to find a nurse, but everyone is busy. Can you please just come back there and look at him?" Sarah looked at him, her eyes cool, calm, and completely unreadable. "I am the charge nurse tonight, Mark," she said, her voice dropping into her quiet, professional register. "I do not have a direct patient assignment. Your father's nurse is Jessica. She will be in to see him as soon as she finishes her shift change report." Mark leaned his heavy forearms on the high, polished laminate counter of the nurse's station. His large, grease-stained hands twisted his truck keys, the metal clinking with a sharp, nervous sound in the quiet space of the unit. He left a faint, greasy smear on the clean surface, a physical mark of the outside world breaking into the sterile environment. "Sarah, please," Mark whispered, his voice low and desperate. He looked around the desk, his eyes darting to the other nurses who were quietly typing at their terminals. Brenda is losing her mind in there. She is already yelling at the nursing assistant because she thinks they are taking too long with his intake paperwork. She is demanding they bring him a warm blanket and some water. "Your father is on a strict fluid restriction, Mark," Sarah said, her voice cool, measured, and perfectly level. "He cannot have water until the doctor evaluates his swallowing and confirms his fluid status." The nursing assistant was following standard protocol. "Well, Brenda does not know that," Mark said, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself and brought it back down to a harsh whisper. "She is just worried. You know how she is. She got scared yesterday because of the black fluid. We are both exhausted, Sarah. We have been at the clinic and the emergency room for 6 hours. Can you please just walk down the hall for 5 minutes? Just tell Brenda what is going on so she will calm down." Sarah began her physical routine. She picked up a stack of printed telemetry reports, tapping the edges against the desk to align them perfectly. She slid them into a clean plastic clipboard, her movements slow, deliberate, and entirely calm. "I am the charge nurse tonight, Mark," she said, her eyes meeting his. "I am responsible for the safety of 40 patients on this unit. I cannot leave the central desk to manage individual family members. Jessica is your father's assigned nurse. She is fully capable of explaining the plan of care to Brenda." Mark stared at her, his jaw tightening. He looked at her clean pressed scrubs, her clinical badge, and the smooth professional armor she had pulled around herself. He looked like a man who had suddenly stepped into a room he thought he knew, only to find all the furniture rearranged. "He is your father-in-law, Sarah," Mark said, his voice dropping into a hard, accusing tone. "He is not just a patient. You have been taking care of him for 2 years. Now he is lying in a hospital bed down the hall, and you are sitting here behind a desk, acting like you do not even know him. Are you really doing this to punish us, just because we had a disagreement yesterday?" Sarah paused, her fingers resting on the metal clip of her clipboard. She calculated the energy of this conversation. For 2 years she had been the bridge. Whenever Arthur had a symptom, she was the one who translated it. Whenever Mark was confused, she was the one who explained it. Whenever Brenda wanted to argue, Sarah was the one who patiently smoothed things over, absorbing their frustration and their disrespect because she wanted to keep the peace. They had treated her labor as a natural resource, something they were entitled to simply because she was married to Mark. Now she was withdrawing that resource. If she walked down the hall to room 414, she would be stepping back into the trap. She would be validating Brenda's behavior, allowing Mark to escape his own responsibility, and putting herself back in the position of being blamed the moment something went wrong. "This is not a punishment, Mark," Sarah said, her voice remaining quiet and flat. "This is professional boundary. You and Brenda made a decision yesterday to manage his care yourselves. You decided that my nursing license and my clinical experience were not trustworthy. You told me to stop managing his medications. I have complied with your request." "But that was at home," Mark said, his voice tinged with a desperate, childish frustration. "This is the hospital." "The clinical reality is the same," Sarah said. "I am not his primary care provider. I am an employee of this hospital. If I intervene in his care without being his assigned nurse, I violate hospital policy and compromise his safety." She picked up her black pen, clicked the top with a soft sound, and began to write her signature at the bottom of the shift assignment log. Mark stood on the other side of the counter, his mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to scream, but the quiet, professional atmosphere of the unit held him back. He was a man accustomed to physical problems he could solve with a wrench or a hammer. He did not know how to handle this quiet, absolute refusal. "If Brenda continues to yell at the staff," Sarah added, not looking up from her paperwork, "the floor nurses will notify hospital security. I suggest you go back to the room and tell her to remain quiet while Jessica prepares your father's admission orders." Mark let out a short, bitter laugh. He shook his head, his truck keys clinking loudly in his fist. "I don't even know who you are right now," he said. Sarah did not look up. She kept her eyes on the page, her pen moving with smooth, unbroken lines as she signed the last form. "I am the charge nurse, Mark," she said quietly. Mark stood there for 3 more seconds, his heavy breathing loud in the quiet space of the station, before he turned on his heel. His heavy work boots squeaked against the linoleum as he walked down the hall toward room 414, his shoulders hunched, leaving Sarah alone under the bright, buzzing light of the desk. The red digital clock on the wall of the nurses' station read 11:45 p.m. The ward had settled into its late-night rhythm, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional soft, rhythmic whoosh of the automatic blood pressure cuffs inflating down the hall and the distant metallic rattle of a janitor's cart. Sarah sat at the secondary computer terminal at the end of the desk, shielded from the main corridor by a tall privacy screen. She began her physical routine. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small, silver USB flash drive, and slid it into the side of the monitor. A quiet click echoed in the small alcove as the system recognized the drive. She opened a folder labeled Arthur Miller Health Log. For 2 years, Sarah had maintained a meticulous daily record of Arthur's physical existence. It was not a casual notebook. It was a professional-grade clinical log. There were color-coded spreadsheets detailing his daily blood pressure readings, his morning weight down to the ounce, his fluid intake and output, and his oxygen saturation trends. Every time Arthur had a minor symptom, she had logged it alongside the exact dose of medication she had administered, creating a definitive record of his health. She opened the file and clicked the print icon. Behind her, the heavy laser printer in the corner of the station began to whir, a low mechanical hum that warmed the air. The physical sheets began to slide into the tray one by one, a steady, rhythmic rustle of paper. Sarah stood up and walked to the printer. She picked up the first stack of pages. The paper was hot, smelling of dry ozone and warm toner. She took a blue plastic binder from her bag, opened the metal rings with a sharp metallic snap, and began to slide the pages inside. "Hey, Sarah." Sarah turned. Jessica, the floor nurse assigned to room 414, was leaning against the desk. Her scrub top was slightly rumpled, and she was rubbing her temples with her fingers, her face tight with irritation. "That family in room 414 is a nightmare," Jessica said, her voice dropping into a harsh whisper. "The daughter, Brenda, is trying to tell me how to run an intravenous line. I went in to start his Lasix infusion, and she tried to argue about the drip rate. She actually told me that I was draining him too fast and that he was going to go into hypovolemic shock. She said she looked it up on her phone." Sarah did not flinch. She kept her hands on the warm pages of the printer tray. "What did you do?" "I told her that if she did not let me do my job, I would have the resident doctor come up and explain the physiology of a fluid overload to her," Jessica said, letting out a sharp, bitter laugh. "And I told her that if she kept raising her voice in front of the patient, I would have security escort her out of the building. The husband, your husband, just sat there on the vinyl chair and didn't say a word. He looked like he wanted to crawl under the bed." "You did the right thing, Jessica," Sarah said quietly. "Keep your boundaries." Jessica looked at Sarah, her expression shifting from irritation to a mild, searching curiosity. She leaned closer. "Sarah, I know you were married to Mark. I figured you would be in there helping them out, or at least talking Brenda down. I was actually a little nervous when I saw the name on my assignment sheet, thinking you were going to be micromanaging me all night." Sarah adjusted the pages in her binder, the metal ring snapping shut with a cold, definitive sound. "I am the charge nurse tonight, Jessica," Sarah said, her voice flat and steady. "My duty is to the safety of this entire unit, not to family members who choose to reject clinical expertise. You are his nurse. I trust your judgment completely." Jessica let out a long breath, her shoulders visibly relaxing. "Thank God," she said. "I appreciate that, Sarah. Seriously. Most family members who are nurses are the absolute worst, but you are being a professional." Sarah watched Jessica walk back down the hall toward the supply closet, her soft-soled shoes silent on the linoleum. She returned to her terminal. She clicked on Arthur's electronic chart one last time. She opened the section for emergency contacts and medical proxies. Currently, the hospital system had Sarah listed as the primary medical liaison, the first person the doctors would call for consent or clinical updates. She opened a blank document on her computer screen and began to type a formal letter to the hospital's patient advocate and social work department. The letter was brief, written in the cold, precise language of a clinical administrator. It stated that due to a conflict of interest and a formal refusal of her clinical management by the patient's family, Sarah was officially removing herself as Arthur Miller's medical liaison and emergency contact. Effective immediately, all medical decisions, consent forms, and clinical updates were to be directed solely to his biological children, Mark Miller and Brenda Miller. She printed 2 copies of the letter. She added 1 copy to her blue binder, sliding it behind the plastic cover. This binder was no longer just a record of Arthur's care. It was her legal shield. It was the physical evidence of the invisible labor she had performed for 2 years, and the definitive proof of the moment she had handed that labor back to its rightful owners. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath of the warm, ozone-scented air of the station, and felt a quiet, hard resolve settle in her chest. The preparation was nearly complete. At 3:30 in the morning, the light in the hospital corridors had turned a flat, chalky gray, the color of a rainy dawn that was still hours away. The only movement was the slow, silent rotation of the floor scrubbers in the lobby downstairs, a vibration so faint it felt like a low purr through the soles of Sarah's shoes. Sarah sat in the small, windowless office behind the central desk, a space reserved for the unit's clinical paperwork. She began her physical routine. She placed the formal letter she had printed earlier on top of the hospital's standard change of emergency contact and medical proxy form. She pulled a heavy brown craft interoffice envelope from a metal organizer on the desk. The envelope was thick, with a vertical row of small holes down the center and a red string tie at the top. She used her black ballpoint pen to write the destination in the first empty box on the front: Patient Advocacy and Social Work Department, Floor 2. She folded the 2 documents into thirds, her fingers sliding along the edges of the paper to create clean, sharp creases. She slid the papers inside the heavy envelope. Instead of using the red string, she peeled the wax paper backing off the self-adhesive strip at the top. The sound of the plastic tearing was a crisp, sudden hiss in the quiet room. She pressed the adhesive down, sealing the documents inside. This was the first physical lock on her boundary. Once this envelope was dropped into the metal interoffice mail slot down the hall, the hospital's legal department would process the change. She would be completely erased from Arthur's medical chart. If his condition worsened, if he needed emergency surgery, or if he was ready for discharge. The automated system would bypass her name entirely. The phone calls would go directly to Mark's cell phone, and if he did not answer, they would go to Brenda. She stood up, holding the heavy brown envelope, and walked out to the central desk. The double doors of the unit slid open with a soft pneumatic sigh. Brenda stepped onto the floor. She looked entirely different than she had that afternoon. Her confident, smug posture was gone, replaced by a slumped, defensive slouch. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, loose knot, and her eyes were bloodshot and ringed with dark circles. She was holding an empty plastic pitcher, her knuckles white. She spotted Sarah sitting behind the desk. She walked over, her soft-soled slippers dragging on the linoleum. "Sarah," Brenda said, her voice dropping into a whiny, exhausted tone. "It is freezing in Dad's room. The air conditioner is blowing right on his bed, and we cannot find the remote to turn it down. And he is thirsty. He has been begging for a cup of ice chips for an hour. But that nurse, Jessica, told us he cannot have anything by mouth. Can you please just get us a blanket and a cup of ice? He is 82 years old, Sarah. A little ice is not going to kill him." Sarah did not look up from the envelope she was holding. She finished writing a routing number on the corner of the paper, then set the pen down with a quiet click. She looked at Brenda, her expression polite, professional, and entirely blank. "Your father is on a strict fluid restriction because his lungs are congested, Brenda," Sarah said, her voice level. "Even ice chips melt into water. If he consumes water, it will expand his blood volume and make it harder for him to breathe. Jessica is following the doctor's orders." "But he is thirsty," Brenda protested, her voice rising slightly. Her hand gripped the plastic pitcher tighter. "You are a nurse, Sarah. You know how to make exceptions. Just a tiny cup. And what about the blanket?" "I am the charge nurse, Brenda. I do not manage individual linen requests or patient comfort items. I will page a nursing assistant to bring a warm blanket to room 414. Sarah pressed the button on her desk console, her fingers moving with cool, mechanical precision. "Aid to room 414 for a linen request, please." She released the button, her eyes returning to the computer screen. "Someone will be there shortly," she said, her tone ending the conversation. Brenda stood at the counter for several seconds, her mouth slightly open, waiting for Sarah to say something else. She waited for the familiar sigh, the sudden yielding of Sarah's posture, or the offer to go get the blanket herself to save everyone the trouble. She waited for the daughter-in-law who had spent 2 years smoothing over every rough edge in their family. But the daughter-in-law did not appear. Only the charge nurse remained, her eyes fixed on the blue light of her screen, her hands resting quietly on the desk. Brenda let out a sharp, angry breath, turned around, and walked back down the hall, her slippers squeaking loudly against the clean floor. Sarah watched her go. She felt a quiet, cold calculation settle in her mind. Brenda had been in the hospital for less than 8 hours, and she was already unraveling over a blanket and a cup of ice chips. She did not know how to navigate the complex, unyielding machinery of a medical institution. She did not know how to handle the quiet, absolute authority of the rules. For 2 years, Sarah had shielded them from this complexity, absorbing the friction of the medical world so they never had to feel it. She had been the buffer. Now the buffer was gone. They were about to feel the full, raw weight of the machine they had chosen to manage themselves. Sarah stood up, walked down the quiet corridor to the metal interoffice mail drop on the wall near the elevators, and slid the heavy brown envelope into the slot. It fell with a soft, dull thud into the dark bin below. The gray light of Friday morning was beginning to wash over the telemetry unit, turning the bright computer screens a dull, faded blue. It was 6:30. The high-pitched, rhythmic chime of the shift change alarm on Sarah's watch buzzed against her wrist, a tiny vibration that signaled the end of her 12 hours. She began her physical routine. She sat at her terminal, her fingers moving slowly across the keyboard to complete her final electronic sign-offs. She closed her charge nurse dashboard, printed out the 24-hour shift report summary, and organized the pages into a neat, stapled packet. She took her personal black pen, slid it into her scrub pocket, and stood up to stretch her aching back. The unit was beginning to wake up. The morning shift environmental services worker was pushing a large yellow cart down the hall, the quiet, dry crinkle of plastic trash bags being changed, echoing in the corridor. The rich, dark smell of a fresh pot of coffee brewed by the incoming staff began to drift into the nurse's station, masking the sterile, chemical smell of the night. Ellen, the veteran morning charge nurse, walked behind the desk. She was carrying a colorful thermal mug and a small binder of her own. She looked fresh, her eyes bright, a stark contrast to Sarah's hollow exhaustion. "Morning, Sarah," Ellen said, setting her mug down on the counter. "How was the night? Any major drama?" "Pretty quiet overall," Sarah said, handing over the stapled packet. "We had 2 admissions from the emergency department, 1 discharged to home, and 1 patient in room 408 who had a brief run of ventricular tachycardia, but converted back to normal sinus rhythm on his own. All the telemetry monitors are stable." Ellen flipped through the pages of the report, her thumb sliding down the patient list. She stopped when she reached room 414. "Arthur Miller," Ellen read aloud, her eyebrows rising slightly. "Sarah, is that your father-in-law? I remember Mark's dad's name from when he had his first bypass surgery." Sarah did not look away. Her voice was flat, steady, and entirely neutral. "Yes, he was admitted last night for acute decompensated heart failure." Ellen looked up, her expression turning soft and sympathetic. "Oh gosh, I am sorry, Sarah. Do you want me to assign him to one of our lighter load nurses today? I can keep a close eye on his room for you, make sure the family gets whatever they need. I know how stressful it is when it is your own people on the floor." Sarah kept her hands resting flat on the counter. "No, Ellen, that is not necessary. He is currently assigned to Jessica, and the day shift should treat him exactly as any other patient on the telemetry protocol." Ellen paused, her pen hovering over the page. She looked at Sarah's tired but calm face, sensing the rigid, invisible line that had been drawn. "Are you sure? We can easily prioritize his room." "I have formally removed myself as his medical liaison and emergency contact," Sarah said, her voice remaining quiet and even. "His biological children, Mark and Brenda, are his primary contacts and are responsible for all of his care decisions. They do not trust my clinical input, so I am strictly a spectator. Please treat his room with standard protocol. No special liaison, no exceptions." Ellen's eyes widened slightly, But she was a seasoned nurse who had seen every possible variation of family dynamic over her 30 years on the floor. She nodded slowly, her expression shifting from sympathy to professional respect. "Understood," Ellen said, making a quick, neat note on her sheet. "Standard care. No special intervention. I will make sure the day shift staff knows to direct all communication solely to Mark and Brenda." "Thank you," Sarah said. She picked up her blue plastic binder from the counter. It was heavy, packed with the meticulously printed health logs, medication schedules, and specialist contact sheets she had spent the night organizing. This was the ledger of her 2 years of invisible labor, a physical record of the silent protection she was about to formally hand over. She calculated the morning events. Arthur's aggressive intravenous diuretic therapy would continue through the day. If he dumped enough fluid, the doctors would likely try to transition him back to oral medications by Saturday morning, preparing him for discharge on Sunday. Once he was discharged, he would be sent home with a complex, highly volatile outpatient regimen: a double dose of furosemide, a new potassium supplement that had to be taken at a specific hour to avoid cardiac arrhythmia, a strict daily weight tracking protocol, and a rigid liquid limit of 1.5 liters per day. Mark and Brenda would have to manage this alone. They would have to count the pills, measure the water, weigh him before breakfast, and interpret his blood pressure readings without her. They would have to be his nurses. Sarah walked away from the central desk, her bag on her shoulder, the blue binder tucked under her arm. Her feet felt heavy on the clean floor, but her mind was remarkably clear. She walked down the quiet hallway toward the elevators, ready to leave the building, but she knew she had one final clinical handoff to make before her weekend could begin. The silence of Sarah's apartment at 7:15 on Friday morning was thick and absolute. She had driven home with the car radio turned off, the only sound being the rhythmic, dry thrum of her tires on the pavement. Now she sat at her small oak dining table. A square of pale morning sunlight had moved across the wood, highlighting the faint rings left by old tea mugs and the thin layer of dust on the corner of the table. She began her physical routine. She set her personal laptop on the wood, the cold aluminum bottom of the casing sending a brief chill through her fingertips. She opened the lid, the screen instantly waking with a bright white flash that illuminated her tired face. Her fingers moved across the trackpad with smooth, mechanical precision, logging into her personal password manager to access the digital infrastructure of Arthur's survival. For 2 years, Sarah had not just been Arthur's physical caregiver. She had been his administrative and financial brain. Because Mark was intimidated by paperwork, and Brenda claimed she did not have the time, Sarah had taken over every portal, every account, and every bureaucratic hurdle required to keep an 82-year-old chronic patient afloat in a fragmented healthcare system. She logged into the Care First mail-order pharmacy portal first. The dashboard showed Arthur's profile. In the center of the screen, a green icon indicated that his next automatic 3-month refill of carvedilol, spironolactone, and potassium chloride was scheduled for shipment on June 20th, just 4 days away. Sarah clicked on the tab labeled Billing and Payment. Under the heading Primary Card, Her own MasterCard was listed, the expiration date and billing address neatly saved. Over the past 24 months, she had quietly absorbed nearly $900 in copays and pharmacy deductibles. She had never asked Mark to repay her, knowing it would spark a long defensive argument about their household budget and his sister's lack of financial contribution. She had simply paid it because she wanted Arthur to have his medicine. She clicked the button labeled Edit Payment Method. She selected her card, clicked Delete, and watched the fields turn white and empty. The screen flashed a red warning. Automatic shipments will be suspended until a valid payment method is provided. She clicked through to the tab labeled Contact Information. She removed her personal email address and her cell phone number. In their place, she typed Mark's email address and Brenda's cell phone number. She calculated the exact trajectory of the administrative friction she was creating. Mark never checked his email. He had an account he had created 10 years ago to set up his phone, and it was currently clogged with thousands of unread junk messages. Brenda's phone was always on loud, but she ignored numbers she did not recognize. When the automated pharmacy system sent the urgent payment required notification on June 20th, the email would sink to the bottom of Mark's unread inbox, and the text message to Brenda would be dismissed as spam. The shipment would not go out. By the time they realized Arthur's pill bottles were empty, the automatic refill window would have closed. They would have to call the pharmacy, wait on hold for 40 minutes, navigate the automated security prompts they did not know the answers to, and provide a credit card they would argue about who should pay. When they tried to rush to the local pharmacy to get a temporary supply, they would find out that the insurance company refused to authorize a local fill because the mail order contract was still active. It was a slow, bureaucratic avalanche, entirely silent and completely inevitable. Sarah logged out of the pharmacy portal. Next, she opened the patient portal for the Tri-County Cardiology Clinic. She navigated to the section labeled Authorized Representatives and Medical Release Forms. She found her name listed as the sole designated proxy authorized to discuss Arthur's clinical records, laboratory results, and scheduling. She clicked the edit icon, removed her name, and entered Mark's and Brenda's names as the co-proxies. She logged out of the portal, closed her laptop lid, and sat perfectly still in the quiet kitchen. The physical routine of her daily labor had been completely dismantled in less than 15 minutes. It had taken about 40 clicks of a mouse to untangle herself from the web of their family's survival, returning the financial and administrative reality of Arthur's illness entirely to his biological children. She had not deleted his accounts. She had not sabotaged his medical records. She had simply returned their inheritance. They wanted to manage Arthur's care. Now they would have to manage all of it, including the silent, frustrating machinery of the insurance portals and the credit card fields that never ran dry. She stood up from the table, carried her laptop back to her bedroom closet, and placed it on the top shelf. The silent preparation was complete. She walked back to her bed, pulled the heavy duvet over her shoulders, and closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the quiet, dark peace of a weekend she no longer had to manage. The morning sun on Saturday was warm and bright, streaming through the sliding glass door of Sarah's small balcony. It was 10:15. The apartment was filled with the soft, clean scent of fresh pine cleaner and the gentle, rhythmic hum of a wind chime hanging outside. Sarah began her physical routine. She sat at her small kitchen table, a newspaper spread across the wood to catch the debris. In front of her was a small green jade plant that had outgrown its plastic starter pot. She used her fingers to gently loosen the dry, compacted soil around the roots, the gritty dirt crumbling into a neat pile on the paper. She picked up a new, heavy terracotta pot, scooped a handful of rich, damp potting soil into the bottom, and carefully lowered the green plant inside, pressing the dark earth down around the thick stem with her thumbs. Her hands were dirty, the dark soil packed beneath her short fingernails. The sudden shrill ring of her cell phone on the counter broke the quiet of the room. Sarah did not rush. She slowly wiped her hands on a damp paper towel, removing the loose dirt, before walking over to retrieve the device. The screen showed the name Sandra, her unit nurse manager. Sarah answered, keeping her voice calm and level. "Sandra?" "Sarah, I am sorry to call you on your weekend off," Sandra said. Her voice was not its usual warm, maternal tone. It was tight, strained, and carried a heavy, formal weight that Sarah recognized instantly from her years in clinical administration. "Is everything okay on the floor?" Sarah asked, leaning against the counter. "The floor is fine," Sandra said, pausing for a long, uncomfortable second. "Sarah, I am calling because an official complaint was filed with the hospital's Risk Management and Patient Relations Department yesterday afternoon. It was submitted by Brenda Miller, and it was co-signed by your husband, Mark, as the patient's designated healthcare proxy." Sarah sat down slowly on the vinyl kitchen stool. She kept her eyes on the small jade plant on the table, its green leaves catching the morning light. "What does the complaint say, Sandra?" Sandra let out a long, heavy sigh. "It is serious, Sarah. They are accusing you of professional misconduct, unauthorized medical interference, and elder abuse. The written statement claims that you have been deliberately manipulating Arthur Miller's medication dosages at home for the past several months, administering harmful chemicals without his consent, and trying to destroy his kidney function to force him into a nursing home. They are demanding a formal investigation by the state licensing board, and they want you suspended from your duties immediately." Sarah felt her breathing remain steady, her heart rate sitting at its normal, quiet rhythm. She did not panic. She did not cry. She did not feel the sudden, hot rush of anger. Instead, she felt a profound, ice-cold clarity. Mark had signed it. He had not just stood by while his sister screamed. He had actively joined her. He had taken his pen, sat down in a hospital office, and signed a formal legal document designed to destroy his wife's career, her nursing license, and her livelihood. He had done it to protect his own pride, to escape the shame of his own ignorance, and to appease his sister's venomous resentment. They had crossed the final, irreversible line. "Sarah," Sandra said, her voice dropping into a quiet, supportive whisper, "I want you to know that I do not believe a single word of this. I know your work. I know how meticulously you manage your patients. and I know how much you have done for Arthur over the last 2 years. But because the patient is currently admitted to our unit, and you were the charge nurse on duty, risk management has to do a formal review. We have to follow protocol." "I understand, Sandra," Sarah said, her voice completely flat and unemotional. "We need you to meet with the risk management director and the hospital's legal counsel on Monday morning at 9 o'clock, Sandra said. "You will need to provide a written statement and any evidence you have regarding your involvement in his home care. Do you have anything that can corroborate your version of events?" "I have everything, Sandra," Sarah said. "I have a daily clinical log of his vitals, his exact medication administrations, his doctor-approved adjustments, and his laboratory results spanning the last 24 months. I also have the signed medical proxy withdrawal form that I submitted to the social work department on Thursday night before the complaint was even drafted." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Sarah could hear Sandra let out a soft, relieved breath. "You have daily logs?" Sandra asked. "Yes," Sarah said, "color-coded, dated, and cross-referenced with his pharmacy refills and cardiology appointment sheets." Sandra let out a short, triumphant laugh. "Oh, thank God. Sarah, you have no idea how much of a relief that is. If you have those logs, this complaint is going to evaporate the second risk management looks at it. It will prove they were fully aware of the care and that you were acting under direct physician guidelines. Bring the entire file with you on Monday." "I will," Sarah said. "Thank you, Sarah. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. We will see you Monday morning." Sarah ended the call. She set the phone on the counter, her eyes returning to her hands. There was still a thin line of dark, damp soil trapped beneath the cuticle of her left thumb. She walked back to the kitchen table. She picked up the terracotta pot, carried it to the balcony, and set it on the small wooden stand in the corner. She watered the jade plant slowly, watching the clear water sink into the dry earth, leaving the soil dark, rich, and settled. The final trap was not something she had built out of malice. It was a trap they had constructed themselves, out of their own arrogance, their own defensiveness, and their own desperate need to find a scapegoat. They had thought her silent withdrawal was a sign of weakness, an invitation to strike. They did not know that her silence was the sound of the concrete setting around them, sealing them into the dark, cold reality of their own choices. She walked back inside, slid her glass sliding door shut, and went to her closet to retrieve the blue plastic binder. The laundry basket on the living room sofa was piled high with warm, clean fabrics, fresh from the apartment building's basement dryer. It was 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. The scent of lavender fabric softener sheets hung in the warm, quiet air of the room, a domestic and peaceful aroma that felt completely detached from the storm gathering outside. Sarah began her physical routine. She reached into the wicker basket, pulled out a large, thick white bath towel, and snapped it once, a clean, sharp sound that echoed off the drywall. She brought the corners together, folding the towel in half, then in thirds, smoothing her palms flat across the warm cotton to press out any wrinkles. She placed the neat square on the coffee table and reached for the next one. From the driveway outside, the familiar low-frequency rumble of a diesel engine vibrated through the floorboards. It was Mark's truck. The engine idled for several seconds before sputtering to a halt. Sarah did not stop folding. She picked up a blue hand towel, aligning the seams with methodical precision. She heard the heavy metallic clunk of his truck door slamming shut, followed by the slow, dragging sound of his work boots scraping against the gravel driveway. The front door unlocked, the latch clicking open with a loud, sudden scrape. Mark walked into the living room. He looked battered, his grease-stained canvas jacket hanging off his shoulders, his face pale and grease-smeared under the brim of his dirty baseball cap. He smelled of cold diesel, stale tobacco, and the flat, sour scent of hospital cafeteria food. He did not look Sarah in the eye. He walked straight to the kitchen counter, tossed his truck keys onto the wood, where they slid and clattered against the ceramic fruit bowl, and then turned around, leaning his back against the counter with his arms crossed.
"We had to do it, Sarah," Mark said. His voice was raspy, dry, and defensive, carrying a hard, desperate edge. Sarah did not look up from her laundry. She picked up a pair of gray cotton socks, rolled them together into a neat ball, and placed them in the basket. "I know," she said quietly. Mark blinked, his posture stiffening. He had clearly spent the 3-mile drive from the hospital preparing himself for a screaming match. He had expected her to be waiting for him by the door, tears in her eyes, demanding to know why he had signed a document that could end her career. He had expected a battle he knew how to fight, with anger and volume. Her quiet, mechanical calmness threw him completely off balance. "Brenda said it was the only way," Mark said, his voice rising slightly as he tried to claw back some authority. He began to pace the narrow strip of linoleum between the kitchen and the living room, his boots squeaking loudly. "The doctors at the hospital were treating us like we were stupid, Sarah. They wouldn't listen to anything we said about his kidneys. They just kept saying he had to have the water pills. Brenda said they were covering for you. She said if we didn't file the complaint, you would just lie to them and make us look like the bad guys." Sarah aligned the seams of another towel. She felt a dull, heavy pity for him, but it was entirely clinical, the way she might feel for a patient who had deliberately ignored a warning label and swallowed a bottle of bleach. "You signed a document accusing me of elder abuse, Mark," she said, her voice remaining perfectly level, her hands smoothing the cotton towel. "Well, you left us with no choice," Mark barked, his hands flying out of his pockets. "You walked away from him. He was lying in that bed, struggling to breathe, and you just sat behind that desk like a stranger. You wouldn't even come down the hall to look at his legs. You are his family, Sarah. You are my wife. But you treated us like we were just some annoying patients on your floor. Brenda said you were trying to teach us a lesson." "I was performing my duties as the charge nurse," Sarah said flatly. "That is hospital talk," Mark shouted, stepping closer, his boots thumping hard against the floorboards. "We don't care about your hospital rules, Sarah. My dad's life is on the line. Brenda is in there right now, sitting by his bed, trying to figure out what these doctors are doing. And you are here folding towels. The hospital director is going to look into what you did. They are going to see how you were changing his pills at home without telling us." Sarah folded the towel, her movements slow and deliberate. She set it on top of the pile. She calculated the energy of the room. Mark was completely ignorant of the reality of his situation. He believed that his signature on that complaint was a hammer he had used to smash her composure. He did not know that by signing that paper, he had legally invited the hospital's risk management team and legal department to dissect every single detail
of Arthur's home care. He did not know that on Monday morning, the hospital's investigators would not be looking at her. They would be looking at the daily clinical logs she had kept. They would see the precise record of her labor, her payments, and his family's repeated, documented refusal to follow medical advice. They would see the formal proxy withdrawals she had filed before his complaint was even written. And they would see the financial and administrative void she had left behind. Mark was standing in a house of cards he had built with his sister's venom, and he was currently bragging about the strength of the wind. "Is that all you have to say?" Mark demanded, his chest heaving under his canvas jacket. "You are not even going to deny it? You are not going to tell me what you did with his pills?" "I have nothing to say to you, Mark," Sarah said quietly.
She picked up the heavy wicker basket of folded laundry, holding it against her hip. She looked at him, her eyes cool, calm, and completely empty of any affection or anger. She walked past him, her shoulder brushing his jacket slightly as she made her way into the bedroom, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the silent room, his dirty work boots leaving a faint trail of gray gravel on the clean floorboards. The administrative wing on the second floor of St. Jude Community Hospital felt completely detached from the clinical chaos of the wards below. There was no smell of antiseptic, no sound of call lights, and no squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. The floors were covered in a thick slate gray carpet that muffled every step, and the air was cool, quiet, and smelled faintly of expensive dark roast coffee and polished wood. It was 8:55 on Monday morning. Sarah sat in a high-backed leather chair in the risk management conference room. Sandra sat to her left, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her face serious but calm. Across the polished mahogany table sat Mr. Henderson, the hospital's risk management director, a sharp, gray-haired man in a dark charcoal suit, and Ms. Carter, a representative from the hospital's legal counsel. Sarah began her physical routine. She set her blue plastic binder in the center of the dark wood table. She opened the plastic cover with a soft, clean sound and turned to the first section labeled Timeline of Care, June 2024 to present. She slid her thumb under the first tab, opened the metal rings with a sharp click, and slid the first 50 pages of her meticulously printed spreadsheet across the polished table toward Mr. Henderson. Miss Carter leaned forward, her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she picked up the document. The complaint filed by Brenda and Mark Miller alleges that you have been manipulating Arthur Miller's medication without authorization, Mr. Henderson said, his voice flat, professional, and entirely neutral. He opened a thin manila folder in front of him. They claim you administered a toxic dose of an iron supplement on Wednesday morning, causing gastrointestinal bleeding, and that you have been deliberately withholding his water pills to induce renal failure. Sarah did not look down. Her hands rested flat on her lap, her posture perfectly straight. On Wednesday morning at 5:45 a.m., Sarah said, her voice dropping into her quiet, clinical register, I prepared Arthur Miller's morning medications. This included 65 milligrams of ferrous sulfate prescribed by his cardiologist, Dr. Vance, for chronic anemia. The medical warning on the bottle, which the family referenced in their complaint, lists dark stool as a standard, harmless side effect.
It is not internal bleeding. I documented this side effect in my log at 6:15 a.m. on Wednesday." She reached into her binder, pulled out another section, and slid it across the table. "This is the daily log of his home care," Sarah continued. "As you can see, every single dose of furosemide, carvedilol, and potassium has been recorded with the corresponding date, time, and his pre-dose manual blood pressure and heart rate. On Wednesday afternoon, the family made a unilateral decision to withhold his furosemide because they believed his kidney function was declining. I warned them, both verbally and in writing, that skipping his diuretic would lead to rapid fluid retention and acute decompensation. They refused the medication." Mr. Henderson flipped through the pages of the spreadsheet. His eyes moved rapidly across the rows of numbers, his expression shifting from a professional mask of skepticism to a sudden, absolute stillness. Miss Carter picked up the next sheet, her eyes widening slightly as she read the columns of manual vitals, daily weights, and sodium calculations. "This is incredibly detailed," she said, her voice dropping its formal edge. "You kept a daily clinical record of his weight?" "Yes," Sarah said. "Daily weights are the primary diagnostic tool for monitoring fluid retention in Class 3 heart failure. On Thursday morning, after they skipped his diuretic, his weight increased by 4 pounds in 24 hours. That indicates nearly 2 liters of fluid retention. I documented this and warned the husband. They ignored the warning." Sarah pulled the final document from her binder and set it on the mahogany table. "This is the certified receipt of my healthcare proxy and emergency contact withdrawal," Sarah said. "As you can see, it was time-stamped by the hospital social work department on Thursday night at 7:40 p.m. The complaint against me was not drafted or submitted until Friday afternoon at 2 o'clock. At the time of his admission, I was no longer his legal medical liaison. I assigned his care to Nurse Jessica to maintain a strict professional boundary and prevent any conflict of interest." There was a heavy, profound silence in the conference room. The only sound was the quiet, rhythmic tick of the small silver clock on the credenza behind Mr. Henderson. Sandra let out a soft, slow breath, a faint smile touching the corners of her mouth as she looked at the papers spread across the table. Ms. Carter took off her reading glasses and set them on the wood. She looked at Mr. Henderson, then turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Miller, this log completely refutes every allegation in the complaint," Ms. Carter said, her voice firm and decisive. "In fact, it does something else. It documents a severe, consistent pattern of medical noncompliance, medication withholding, and neglect by the patient's family, despite clear professional guidance from a licensed nurse. By filing this complaint, they have created a permanent, discoverable record of their own negligence." Mr. Henderson closed his manila folder with a heavy thud. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a deep, professional relief. "The hospital's investigation into this matter is closed, Mrs. Miller," Mr. Henderson said. "We will notify the state licensing board that the complaint has been reviewed, found to be entirely malicious and without merit, and dismissed. Our legal department will also be sending a formal letter to Mark and Brenda Miller, warning them about filing false reports to a state agency and informing them that their accusations have exposed them to significant personal legal liability." "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," Sarah said. She stood up from her chair. She did not feel a rush of triumph. She felt only a quiet, absolute coldness. She picked up her copies of the documents, slid them back into her blue plastic binder, and closed the rings with a sharp click. "If my presence is no longer required," she said, looking at Sandra, "I have some personal business to attend to." "Of course, Sarah," Sandra said, her eyes shining with support. "Take all the time you need." Sarah walked out of the conference room, her heavy blue binder tucked under her arm. She walked down the quiet, carpeted corridor of the administrative wing, her steps firm and deliberate. She took the elevator down to the main lobby, the heavy glass doors sliding open to reveal the bustling, sunlit entrance of the hospital. Through the glass, she could see Mark and Brenda sitting on the plush leather chairs near the information desk, their arms crossed, looking toward the elevators with smug, expectant expressions. They were waiting for her to come down in tears, escorted by security, stripped of her badge and her life. They did not know that she was coming for them. The morning sun flooded through the 3-story glass walls of the hospital lobby, casting long, sharp squares of white light across the polished gray terrazzo floor. It was 9:30. The air smelled of roasted espresso beans from the coffee cart in the corner and the subtle, clean scent of fresh lilies in the decorative planters. Sarah walked across the wide expanse of the lobby. Her steps were even, measured, and light. As she walked, she began her physical routine. She raised her left hand, her eyes fixed on the simple gold band resting on her ring finger. She used her right thumb and index finger to grip the metal. The gold was warm from her skin. With a slow, steady twist, she slid the band over her knuckle. The metal slipped off easily, leaving a thin, pale circle of skin where it had rested for 7 years. She did not look at the ring. She kept her eyes forward, her gaze locking onto the 2 figures sitting on the brown leather sofa near the main entrance. Brenda was leaning back, her legs crossed, a smug, self-satisfied grin playing on her lips. She was whispering something to Mark, who sat beside her, his shoulders hunched, his hands nervously tapping against his knees. They looked like 2 people who had just bought a winning ticket and were waiting to collect their prize. As Sarah approached, Brenda's smile widened. "Well, look who it is," she said, her voice carrying a loud, grating confidence through the quiet lobby. "I guess you are not looking so high and mighty now. Did they take your little badge, Sarah? Did they tell you that you cannot go around drugging our father anymore?" Sarah stopped exactly 3 feet in front of them. She did not sit down. She stood tall, her posture straight, her blue hospital scrubs neat and unwrinkled. Her clinical identification badge was still securely clipped to her collar, the holographic emblem catching the bright morning light. She looked at Brenda, then turned her eyes to Mark. Her face was completely blank, empty of any anger, any pain, or any husband and wife familiarity. She looked at them the way she might look at a pair of standard medical charts. "The hospital's risk management department has officially dismissed your complaint," Sarah said. Her voice was quiet, clear, and carried a steady clinical weight that cut through the lobby's background hum. "They found the allegations to be entirely malicious, false, and without merit." Brenda's grin froze. Her foot stopped dangling. "What?" she stammered, her voice dropping its loud confidence. "That is a lie. You are just trying to make yourself look good. We filed the paperwork. They have to investigate you." "The investigation is complete," Sarah said, her voice remaining perfectly level. "The hospital's legal counsel is currently drafting a formal letter that will be sent to your home address. It will inform you that by filing a false report with the state licensing board, you have exposed yourselves to personal legal liability. Your complaint has created a permanent, discoverable record of your own medical negligence." Mark stood up, his truck keys clinking loudly in his hand. He looked at her badge, then at her calm, steady eyes. His face turned a pale, sickly gray. "Sarah, what are you talking about? Brenda said we had to protect Dad." "You did not protect him, Mark," Sarah said. "You neglected him. For 2 years, I kept a daily, meticulous clinical log of his vitals, his weights, and his medication compliance. Those logs are now a permanent part of the hospital's official review. They prove that you and Brenda willfully withheld his heart medications, which is the sole reason he is currently in room 414. Sarah reached down and pulled the heavy blue plastic binder from her bag. She held it out in front of her. On top of the blue cover, she placed her gold wedding ring. "And there is more," she continued, her voice cold and flat. "I have formally removed myself as your father's healthcare proxy, emergency contact, and medical liaison. The paperwork was processed on Thursday night. From this moment on, the doctors and social workers will contact you and Brenda for every single decision, every consent form, and every detail of his care." Mark stared at the gold band resting on the plastic binder. His mouth opened slightly, his chest rising with a shallow, panicked breath. "Sarah, wait. No, you cannot do that. We do not know how to talk to these doctors. We do not know what his schedule is." "You will have to learn," Sarah said. "I have also deleted my credit card from his mail-order pharmacy portal and removed my email as the primary contact. His next shipment of heart medications is currently suspended until you input a valid payment method. All of his copays, his deductibles, and his insurance bills will now be routed directly to your home." "Sarah, please," Mark whispered, his hand shaking as he reached out. "We can talk about this. I didn't want to sign it." "Brenda said we had to. She said you were trying to control us." "I am no longer controlling anything, Mark," Sarah said. She pushed the blue binder into his hands. Mark's fingers closed around the plastic instinctively, the gold wedding ring sliding slightly across the cover before catching on the plastic edge. "This is Arthur's complete clinical history," Sarah said, her eyes locked onto his. "Every specialist's phone number, every medication schedule, and every detail of his care is inside. You and Brenda wanted to manage his life. It is all yours now." Sarah turned on her heel. She did not wait for Mark to speak. She did not look back to see Brenda's pale, terrified face, or the way Mark's shoulders crumbled as he held the heavy plastic binder. She walked toward the sliding glass doors of the lobby. The heavy doors parted with a soft, pneumatic sigh, letting in the fresh, cool morning air. She stepped out onto the concrete plaza, her feet light, her hands empty, and her heart entirely silent as she walked away from their lives forever. The morning sun on Saturday was soft and warm,
casting a gentle golden glow across the clean wooden floor of Sarah's living room. It was 8 o'clock, 1 week after the confrontation in the hospital lobby. The apartment was entirely still, filled only with the quiet, soothing hum of a small fan and the cheerful chirping of sparrows in the oak tree outside the window. Sarah began her physical routine. She set her small dining table for one. She laid down a woven cotton placemat, a clean ceramic plate, and a silver fork. She poured a cup of freshly brewed black coffee, the rich, dark aroma rising in the warm air, and sat down. Her hands were clean, her skin soft, and her fingers free of the gold band that had marked her 7-year marriage to Mark. On her nightstand, her cell phone rested in complete silence. She had changed her number on Tuesday afternoon. The only people who possessed the new digits were her close friends, her mother, and her supervisor, Sandra. There were no frantic text messages, no accusatory voicemails from Brenda, and no late-night phone calls from Mark demanding that she solve a crisis she had not created. On Thursday evening, before her shift, Sandra had pulled her into the quiet office behind the nurse's station to give her the update. Arthur had been discharged on Monday afternoon, just hours after Sarah had dropped the blue binder into Mark's hands. Brenda had taken him home, loudly declaring to the floor staff that they were glad to be free of Sarah's rules and that they would manage his care their own way. The illusion had lasted exactly 4 days. By Wednesday morning, the automated pharmacy notification had bounced back as unpaid. Because Mark never checked his email and Brenda ignored the automated phone warnings, the critical shipment of Arthur's daily heart medications was suspended. By Thursday afternoon, Arthur had missed 3 consecutive doses of his diuretic and his potassium. Brenda, convinced that he just needed some natural strength, had made him a heavy, sodium-rich beef stew and encouraged him to walk around the yard to get his blood moving. By Friday night, the fluid retention was catastrophic. Arthur was in acute respiratory distress, his lungs completely waterlogged, suffocating in his own bed. Mark had panicked, driving his father to the emergency room in the middle of the night. In the ER, Brenda had lost her temper, screaming at the triage nurse and demanding that Sarah be paged down from the 4th floor to fix the doctor's mistakes. But the emergency room physician had opened Arthur's electronic chart. The very first page displayed the red flag warning from risk management and the legal department, alongside Sarah's formal healthcare proxy withdrawal. The physician had looked Brenda and Mark dead in the eye and told them that they had willfully withheld life-saving cardiac medications and violated basic fluid restrictions. He told them that their actions constituted severe clinical neglect and that the hospital was legally obligated to file a formal report with Adult Protective Services. Mark had stood in the sterile hallway of the emergency room, clutching the heavy blue binder Sarah had given him, completely devastated. He had tried to call her old number, only to receive the flat mechanical recording stating that the line was no longer in service. For the first time in his life, there was no buffer. There was no wife to absorb the blame, no nurse to translate the doctor's anger, and no one to carry the weight of his family's pride. He was left entirely alone with the consequences of his choice. Sarah listened to Sandra's report with a quiet, calm detachment.
She did not feel a rush of petty triumph, nor did she feel the sting of regret. She felt only the profound, peaceful closure of a survivor who had stepped off a sinking ship just before it slipped beneath the waves. She had saved Arthur's life twice. She had given 7 years of her life to a family that viewed her labor as a natural resource to be exploited, and her expertise as a threat to their pride. She had done enough. Her sacrifice was real, but her dignity was worth more. Sarah took a slow, quiet sip of her warm coffee, looking out at the green leaves of the oak tree dancing in the soft morning breeze. She felt a deep, overwhelming sense of freedom, a clean slate, and a quiet, beautiful peace that she had not known in years. Her journey had been long and exhausting, but she had reached the other side with her integrity intact and her head held high. If this story reminded you that families should never take love, sacrifice, or silent boundaries for granted, you are not alone. Sometimes the most painful decision we make is also the most necessary, proving that truth eventually comes to light, and that we must first respect ourselves before we can hope for others to do the same. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done if you were in Sarah's shoes? Would you have stayed, or would you have walked away to protect your own peace? If you believe in stories of resilience, dignity, boundaries, and second chances, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing this journey with others. Thank you for listening and for standing with us in the belief that truth always finds its way home. In the end, the quietest boundaries are often the loudest truths, reminding us that you can only save a home when the people inside value the hands that build it.